Yeah, hi everyone. Again, lots of exciting things to talk about today. So, you may have noticed in the past that I've been covering a lot of these big projects from companies like Facebook AI Research and Google AI Research. I wanted to emphasize I'm not affiliated with any of these companies or projects. It's just like these are big projects and are very catchy, and also that makes them sometimes very interesting, which is why I kind of try to keep up with what other people are doing, and these are usually the ones that kind of stick out. But I will also try in the upcoming weeks to be more selective, or also, let's say, more diverse in terms of covering both little and big projects that are interesting. So today I don't have a particular theme. I just selected some things that came to mind or that I stumbled upon. So little projects, big projects, a little bit of both. So because there are lots of things to talk about today, let me not waste too much time on this introduction and get started. Yeah, so the first project I want to talk about today is this text box GAN I saw on GitHub this week. As far as I am concerned, and as far as the author is concerned, this is also the first application of a GAN to generating new text boxes. So here are some examples of how they might look like. So why are we interested in that? Well, maybe you can use that to design a new poster or something like that. But essentially, I think it's just like a nice and simple application of a GAN for generating some new data. So later in this course, we will also be talking about GANs in more detail. So here it's just like an example of how a GAN might look like. And also this GitHub repository contains a really nice description of how this works. And it's really, just a nice example project here. So what is going on here? Maybe just to briefly walk you through this. So a GAN usually consists of two parts. There is a generator and a discriminator. So the generator is essentially trying to generate new data that mimics the data in the training set. And the task of the discriminator is to tell apart whether the generator generated fake data, like data that is different from the training set distribution, or data that is similar to the training set distribution. So essentially, the generator will learn, or tries to learn, to fool the discriminator such that the discriminator cannot distinguish between generated and real images. And in that sense, you can think of the generator as learning the training data set distribution. So here there's like a slight modification. A GAN is usually a little bit simpler. So here, in addition to that, so there are two things going on. A normal GAN usually gets some noise as input. So the noise gets encoded. It's basically a vector that goes into the network, and the network then generates the new data. So why the noise? It's such that otherwise, you need the noise, otherwise the generator will always produce the same output, right? If you think of it as a function. So in that way, the noise is such that it will create different outputs. And here, in addition to that, there is also the word encoder, which takes as input a word. So this word will be then included in this output image. So, to ensure that this word is indeed included in this output image, there's also this OCR module, which will judge whether this text here resembles the text that was put in. So this is also why you can't use this module here for generating, let's say, image captchas, because then like these captchas that are used for verifying whether you are human when you log into a website, here this wouldn't be useful, because I would say it's too easy to solve, because the OCR is able to tell which word it is, right? So in that way, you can simply design a robot to fool, or a bot to fool this captcha generator. But anyways, this is actually a quite useful technique to just add an additional constraint here. For instance, a couple of years ago, we also worked on face privacy, where we wanted to hide certain face attributes, and we also, in a project called Privacy Net, we also designed a GAN that hides face information while still maintaining face matching accuracy, or the same face matching accuracy, so that the generated images are still useful in practice. But then, so the goal was essentially to having face images still being useful for, let's say, passport verification purposes, but then if someone captures images on a security camera, the person shouldn't be able to do some data mining on, let's say, the gender of the person and so forth. So here then we use face matcher in a similar manner. Anyways, so here then the discriminator judges whether the generated image is fake or not, and essentially this whole network will then learn how to generate new text boxes. Yeah, so here's a slightly larger project. I already wanted to cover it like 1 week ago, but the episode was already too long, so I moved it into this week's episode. But I think that is something worth talking about. So this is like a really large model. It's called M6, a Chinese multimodal pre-trainer. And this was a collaboration between Alibaba and the Tsinghua University. So here what they did is they trained, I think they used the Megatron from NVIDIA. They trained 1.9 terabytes of images, or they trained on 1.9 terabytes of images, and 292 gigabytes of text. So it's a really large effort here. And what's essentially new and interesting here is that it is in Chinese and not English. So it's kind of interesting to see that these language models also perform pretty well on other languages that are not English languages. Because in Chinese, also you probably know this better than I do, but you have all these different types of characters. So English text is, I would say, much simpler because you only have 24 characters. Here, that's a little bit more challenging. So it's kind of an interesting case study as well, I think. So they trained actually two models, a 10 billion and a 100 billion parameter transformer. And so this was done with self-supervised pre-training. And then the pre-trained model can actually be used for many different tasks downstream. For instance, the model can be used for generating descriptions, doing image search, for Q&A or poem generation, and many, many different things. So just in a nutshell, I don't want to go into too much detail, but how did they accomplish that? How can they use the model on so many different downstream tasks? So essentially how they achieve that is by masking. So they have the same model. They call it here a unified encoder-decoder. I'm not an expert in these large language models, but I think this is based on NVIDIA's Megatron. I've seen something similar before. In any case, so here they have like these different masking strategies. So for instance, when they want to use the model for text denoising, they would mask out all the gray parts here, which is the IP, they call it IP, and DT mostly. So, but they maintain some DT. So what is IP, ET, and DT? So IP are image patches, ET are encoder tokens, and DT are decoder tokens. So encoder is, you can think of it as the input tokens, let's say text input tokens, and decoder are more like the output tokens. So for text denoising, the model gets decoder and encoder tokens. And let's say for language modeling, there's only the decoder tokens. And for image captioning, they use, of course, the image patches together with the decoder tokens and so forth. So in this way, based on the task, they use different types of inputs. So they have like this masking strategy. So with that, they are able to train one single model essentially. Yeah, totally unrelated to the previous project, I saw a very interesting project on arXiv this week. So this project essentially highlights how fragile deep learning can still be in practice, and that we have to be a little bit careful about certain things when we are using it. So the project I'm talking about is actually not the project on this slide, but on the next slide. But it reminded me of this one that I saw about approximately almost a year ago. So here, just to describe you what's going on here. So here the authors try to fool Tesla's autopilot system. So if you haven't heard of Tesla's autopilot, it's essentially a self-driving car program inside the Tesla car, which can to some extent automatically control the Tesla car, like steering it on the highway. I don't have a Tesla. I only are vaguely familiar with it, but based on what I hear from people, it's somewhat okay, but it's of course not something that you want to blindly rely on. And this paper also highlights some of the issues with that system. I'm not sure if this is already fixed, but in any case, so what's going on here is that the authors, they try to fool the autopilot system. So what they did is they projected, let's say, street signs into trees. And that, was essentially fooling the system, thinking that this is actually a real street sign. And you can think of a real world application. If there's some malicious actor, they could maybe essentially project certain things and then cause crashes and stuff like that. Or here, for instance, they projected a silhouette of Elon Musk onto the street, and the car was then thinking there's a person on the street and was braking pretty hard and things like that. So yeah, what I saw in arXiv was essentially an update of that, or I think these are different authors, right? Yeah, but it was essentially a pretty interesting project where they did something similar with laser beams. So here they essentially projected laser beams into the image, and by that they could also fool the cars essentially. So I think this one here definitely takes more effort if you are, let's say, a malicious actor and you want to, for some reason, fool the car. I think having something that can project a street sign, you need a projector essentially. It's a little bit more effort to do that, but something like a laser beam, having something like that might be more concerning because, these laser beams, they are more, I would say, easier to carry around and things like that. So that essentially highlights there's still a long way to go for making self-driving cars safe. Yeah, related to the topic of safety, there's also another important topic, fairness. So how do we design fair machine learning and deep learning systems? Yeah, Facebook had a blog post on that topic this week called On the Ground, Applying Algorithmic Fairness Approaches to Complex Production Systems. And in this blog post there was also a link to a research paper. It's a very a relatively long paper, but a recommended read. I think it's an important topic. So in this paper they outline the challenges and approaches they take to making machine learning and deep learning fair. So it's actually a pretty tricky problem that they have there. So I'm not an expert in this area, but it seems like it's not so easy to solve. But one thing I wanted to highlight from that is regarding label fairness, because in practice we usually assume that the labels that we have for a given data set, that they are correct or that they are the definite ground truth labels. But in a real world, it's not always so obvious or not always so clear whether these labels are correct or whether we should take them literally or whether we should take them with a grain of salt. So for instance, as they say here, is things like when you have websites, so you can perfectly measure whether users click on a given button. So if you want to measure or predict website clicks themselves are labels that are pretty confident, or you are pretty sure if someone clicks on that, you can measure this pretty confidently, a click or not. But other things, for instance, if you deal with topics like identifying bullying, so the labels that you may use for that, they are usually, for instance, generated by a human who is labeling certain posts, whether they are related to bullying or not. And because that's based on human judgment, it may also embed human biases. So in certain cases, whether a label is correct or not, it's more, I would say, subtle. There's also a gray zone and things like that. So also, like they say here, there's usually a policy written down to identify bullying, and it's also important, to have a good policy for the labelers to apply. And then, but different people, apply the policy maybe differently, and there are these implicit and explicit biases that labelers have. So in that way, in certain contexts, it's actually not so simple. We cannot always believe that these labels are the definite ground truth. So that kind of makes certain topics or applications for machine learning and deep learning a little more challenging than others. Related to that, what I wanted to mention for your class project, what might be also an interesting thing to do is to take a sample of your data set. So if you are working on a classification problem, let's say you have a data set of 100 images, or let's say 100,000 images, take, let's say, 100 images, and then look at these 100 images, and without looking at the labels, try to predict what class label it is. And then you count the numbers of times you were correct, and then divide that number by 100, and then you get a feeling for what the human accuracy is on that data set. How the human predictions relate to the labels that are actually the ones contained in your data set. It gives you a feeling of the difficulty of the task too. So, for instance, if you have the MNIST dataset, take maybe 100 MNIST digits and try to predict which number it is. And let's see whether you get 100% accuracy or not. So it gives you also an idea of whether the labels are even correct in the dataset, but also how difficult the task is. Yeah, since we talked about improving generalization performance this week, and we will continue to talk about this topic this week, there was an interesting research article on understanding generalization in deep learning from the perspective of online and offline learning. So the title of the article is "Good Online Learners Are Good Offline Generalizers." So here they had two scenarios, a real-world scenario. So the real-world scenario is essentially what we have also always considered in class. So we have a given training set, and we train a model on n training examples from that data set where we have mini-batch stochastic gradient descent. And we run that for multiple epochs. So essentially, this thing is just describing what we are doing when we are working with a training set where we have where we do stochastic gradient descent with mini batches, and we repeat that for multiple epochs. But then they have another scenario, they call that the ideal world. So here, instead of doing mini batch gradient descent on the training set, instead of having a fixed size training set, they have infinite data. So they are drawing every time a new mini batch from the distribution of new data. So they have an infinite pool of new data, and they don't have epochs because the data never repeats. They always draw new data. And here what they are doing is they are comparing how the real world compares to the ideal world. So here this is essentially illustrating that once we complete one epoch, we start from scratch. I mean, we do another round and another round. So we reuse the same training set for training. In an ideal world, we always move forward and have new samples. What they found was pretty interesting, actually, that there is actually no difference whether we have the ideal world or the real world case in terms of the generalization performance. So both the ideal world and a real world setting result in models that have the same performance on the test set. So they have a test set where they measure the performance then. And here this is the number of iterations. So it's hard to see, but you can see there are two lines here, a red line and a blue line. And blue corresponds to the real world scenario and red to the ideal world. And you can see there's virtually no difference. So there's one caveat though with that study. So one is how they generated the new data for the ideal world scenario. So here they used a model to do that. So they used a model that constructed 6 million synthetic Cypher-10-like images by sampling from a certain generative model. And how did they then get the labels for that? They used another model that was used then to label these images. Here they had a model with 98.5% accuracy. So this is an okay approach because where should you get all the data from otherwise, right? But this is also a little caveat because these are not real images. They are generated images that look like real images using a generative model. Any case, it's still an interesting study. And another little thing I want to mention is it's actually not the test set error. It's something called test soft error. So it's not a tested accuracy, but a soft error. I was a bit confused by that. I haven't seen that before. So they had a paragraph on that. So here it's essentially what they call a soft accuracy of classifiers defined as the softmax probability on the correct label. So instead of using the argmax on the softmax, where in the softmax recall we have class membership probabilities, they use the highest probability score and compute the accuracy that way as a soft accuracy. Honestly, I'm not exactly sure why they are doing that, why they are not reporting the regular test set accuracy, but that's an interesting point here. And to ensure that this observation was not just an artifact particular to this ResNet model that they used, they also tried it with different models and saw the same effect. One more visualization from that paper. So here they also looked at pre-training. So what they did is here they had a model for the ideal and real world scenario, and with and without pre-training. So the one without pre-training, this is like the random weight initialization. And pre-training is essentially pre-training here the model on ImageNet and then using the weights and training it further on that Cypher-10 dataset. So what they found here is, if you look at, so the dotted line is ideal world and the real world is the solid line. and in red, that is the random. It's a little bit hard to read this graph, to be honest, or not hard, but you have to think a little bit about it. So this is the random in it, and the blue ones are pre-training. And then what you can see here is the dotted one is again the ideal, and the solid one is the real world. And you can see for the random initialization, like we've seen before, there's no difference really whether we use the real world or ideal world scenario. And the same is true for the pre-trained model. There's also not much difference. However, what is interesting here though is, of course, that pre-training really helps. So this is the, again, test soft error, and you can see that the pre-trained model has an error that goes down much quicker than the one for the random tested. So it highlights that pre-training a model on a larger data set first, instead of doing a random weight initialization, is actually really good for getting good performance faster. Also, what's also interesting is that the final performance, there's also a huge gap. So it's not only training faster, but it also results in a better model here. Yeah, and related to pre-training, so there was another interesting project called SEER, where SEER stands for self-supervised. So pre-training is essentially very similar to self-supervised learning. So self-supervised learning is a form of pre-training in that sense. So on the previous slide, I showed you that they pre-trained a model on ImageNet, but there they just used the labels that were contained in ImageNet. Self-supervised learning is basically, it's like pre-training, but you use a data set that is unlabeled, and then you generate the labels for that based on some information on the data set. For example, you can mask certain things in an image, or you can cluster the images and things like that. So we talked a little bit about self-supervised learning before. It's a little bit beyond the scope of this class. So I mentioned for some class project feedbacks that it might be something interesting for you to look into, but you don't have to, of course, because that would be something more advanced. But in any case, this was an interesting project. So what they did here is they trained a billion parameter model using self-supervised learning, and they used unlabeled data from Instagram. So doing that, they were able to reach a new state-of-the-art performance for self-supervised learning, getting 84.2% top 1 accuracy on ImageNet. How did they do that? They used online clustering algorithm, which is actually a pretty efficient one. It's called SWORF, and this one doesn't rely on pairwise image comparisons. But again, since this is a already very long video, I don't want to go into too much detail. I will probably end this week's stuff in the news section. There's only one more thing I wanted to mention in connection to this project here. There is another interesting library or module, I would call it library, that came out. It's for self-supervised learning benchmarks. So it's a library for state-of-the-art self-supervised learning supporting PyTorch, and it's essentially a library that provides benchmarks and pre-trained models that you can compare with, let's say, your models. So it's essentially a benchmark library that provides pre-trained self-supervised models. It's, I think, a nice thing if you are interested in self-supervised learning, let's say for your class project, an interesting thing to check out.